Okay, so in this video we're going to start taking a look at some of the real secondary tools within DaVinci Resolve. And we're going to focus on the most simple tools to use, and they are the secondary curves. We're going to cover the first three secondary curves in this video. So to get started, I've performed a very simple primary grade on this clip, and now I want to start looking at a secondary grade. Now, as a general rule of thumb, when we make a secondary color adjustment, we want to make a new node, which is Alt or Option and S, in order to make a new serial node. You can see I've already done that on the node tree up here. So, first let's expose the attribute curves, or one of the attribute curves. First, we want to click on the curve icon. We might not have the curves already exposed down here. So if we have a different window in this central lower space here, then we want to click on this curve icon. And by default, the RGB curves that we worked with on the previous video will be exposed. In the upper right of this small window, we have a series of icons up here. These used to be little white dots, and these allow us to select the different secondary curves that we can use within Resolve, with the leftmost being the standard custom curve, the RGB curve. So I'm going to click on the next icon along, which is kind of two little rings, and this is the hue versus hue curve. So what does this do and why would we use it? The hue versus hue curve allows me to take control of the color of some pixels and change them. I can say I want to qualify or select the blue pixels in this image, and I will explain exactly what I'm doing here in a second. I can make all of those blue pixels into green, for example, or purple or cyan or even red or orange if I wanted to go extreme. And this is the purpose of the hue versus hue curve. It allows us to very quickly make more general adjustments to the overall color of different pixels within the image. Now, we've taken a look at what it can do. Let's actually take a real look here at the interface and how to use it properly. First, if I want to get a proper closer look at this, I can hit these little outward facing arrows, and this will pop out into a hovering window. And I'm just going to work on this hovering window because it's easier for you to see. Obviously, it's bigger on the screen. So what I have here is a graph showing the color spectrum and a straight line and also a histogram. Just ignore the histogram for now. We're just going to talk about the line and the kind of rainbow spectrum that we can see. So let's use our previous operation as an example. I can draw a curve out of this straight line, and I can use that to change the hue of pixels from blue or cyan to green. So what's the logic behind this? Well, the horizontal position on this graph is the hue that I am choosing to work with, is the original color, according to this node, that I want to change. So I can place these points by left clicking, just like I can on the custom curves in the previous video. So I left click here and I left click here, and then I can left click and drag in between and I draw a curve. And now this curve is saying all the hues between these 2 points will change, will be rotated, is the correct term, according to how I move this point and draw this curve. So now I can say, right, I've gotten hold of all the blue pixels in this image, I will drag them up, and that will make them green. Or I can drag this point down, and that will make them purple. Now, you may wonder what exactly is happening, what is the logic behind changing the colors here. So let's quickly go over how we can read the change we're making, and to do that we have to use our vector scope. So I've got our vector scope here, and I'm just going to increase the visibility, and I'm going to zoom in so it becomes easier for us to see. So we understand how to read the vector scope by now. We know it reads hue versus saturation and does not give us any position information. And the blue reading is super obvious down here. It's this big long spike between blue and cyan. So it's going to be very easy for us to see the change we're making with this example. If I click this dot here and I drag upwards, it makes, look at that, it makes the blue signal rotate clockwise around the vector scope. It rotates the hue. And I can then see it rotating around until it reaches the green target or gets closer to the green target, and it then becomes green. Conversely, if I drag this point downwards, it rotates counterclockwise and becomes magenta. So this is what we're doing. We're basically grabbing the reading on the vector scope and we're moving it around the circle towards a new target and therefore a new color. And it's super easy to use the curve. It's literally just click, click, define our working area, then click and drag up or click and drag down. And we actually have a set of shortcuts on the lower left down here, these what are called 6 vector targets, that will allow us to easily select all of the main colors on the spectrum: red, yellow, green, cyan, blue and magenta. So if I want to work with blue, I can just click the blue target, and lo and behold, it places 3 points down on my straight line, and I can then move these around to start working on those pixels. So this is what the hue versus hue curve does. It lets us change one color into another. Now, why would we use that? What's the point? It's actually a really powerful tool for getting skin tones in the right place very, very quickly. Because as we can see, if we take a closer look at this image, most of my warm colors are within the skin tones. There's a little bit in the kind of, I think it's a carp painted on the back here, but mostly it's within Wayne's skin tones here. His name is Wayne, I don't think I've mentioned that before. And the dealer, which is the character's name, her skin tones here, she's a bit more yellow. So what we can do is we can drag or we can click to highlight the warmer colors, and this is really annoying. Red is right on the edge of the graph and kind of loops around to the other side, and red is what I find I work with the most in the hue versus hue curve because I mainly do use it to tweak skin tones. And I can change the skin tone color, and it's a bit more tan between red and yellow. I can change the skin tone color should I want to. Now obviously I'm not going to make it green, but for demonstration purposes. And you can see, if you keep an eye on the vector scope, you can see what's happening here. So I can just drag it a little bit closer to the eye line. If I go into my vector scope and let's show the skin tone indicator, there we go. What I could do is I could drag it just a little bit closer to the eye line towards that kind of mythical, imaginary, ideal skin tone. And there, that's just made it a little bit more balanced. Now, clicking and dragging and making very small adjustments is difficult. The point on the graph you have selected has a black core. And then we have input hue and hue rotate in the lower right down here. Input hue, if I click and drag, will move the selected point left or right. And hue rotate, left or right, will move it up or down. So this is actually how I make very accurate adjustments using the hue versus hue curve. And there we go, I've got a basic secondary skin tone adjustment, and it's slight, but you can see he's a little bit oranger, a little bit more yellow there, and a little bit red, a little bit more healthy looking here. But this is only one of the adjustments that I want to make. And to do that, we're going to have to move on to the next curve. So I've closed down my pop-out window, and now I'm going to hit the next icon along, which is the ring and the water drop. And this is hue versus saturation. Now, it looks identical, and it will do because we've not done anything with it yet. And now we might want to start thinking about what does this histogram mean? Because hue versus saturation makes the impact of the histogram quite obvious. I'm just going to pop out again for the sake of demonstration. You don't need to pop this out whenever you use it. So, I now want to change the saturation of the skin tones, but first let's give a little demonstration of the hue versus saturation curve, and let's just talk about what the histogram we're seeing means. Now, we know what a histogram is. It's just value and frequency. The higher the spike, the more pixels of a particular value we have, and that's exactly what we're seeing here. This high spike on my secondary curve tells me I have loads and loads and loads of pixels which are this hue, because it's a big spike on the bluish cyan part of the spectrum, and lo and behold, I can look into my background and look, it's telling me that this wall is A, there's a lot of it, and B, that it's blue and cyan. So that checks out. I can gauge how much visible impact my corrections are going to have by essentially making selections or qualifications around the spikes on the histogram and then dragging up or down. Because if I do that, I'm working with a large number of pixels, and obviously the visible impact is going to be greater. So if I'm thinking, maybe this looks a little bit cool, maybe the blue's a little bit too strong, and I want to change that, well look, the ideal point for me to drag up or down is right on top of this spike here, because this is where the largest number of pixels have the relevant hue. Now, hue versus saturation, as the name implies, lets us qualify based on hue, and then change the saturation of the pixels. So I can now say, look, I've got a lot of very strong blue pixels. I can see from the vector scope they're quite saturated. I can see from the histogram that there's a lot of them. And obviously I can look at the image as well. And I'm thinking maybe this blue is a bit strong. So I'm going to grab here and drag down on top of this spike, and I'm just going to bring the blue down ever so slightly because I thought maybe it was getting a bit distracting in the background down there. And that's how we use hue versus saturation. We say this color is a bit strong, or this color is a bit weak. I want it to get stronger, or I want it to get weaker. And in order to do that, I place these points around the hue I want to change, and then I drag up to make it more colorful, or I drag down to make it less colorful and less saturated. So now I've made a hue versus hue tweak to my skin, and I want to increase the saturation of the skin. I can make more than one adjustment to hue on the same curve. I don't need to make a second node and start with a new curve. I can now just go ahead and I can make my skin tone adjustment here, and the same curve can work on the blues and on the reds. That's absolutely fine. I just need to make sure I define my different working ranges with these points in an appropriate fashion. So now I'm going to take this down here, and what I can do is I can drag up on the warm colours, and look, I'm making the skin more saturated, or I can make it grey, and I'm just going to drag this up until I'm happy with the way the skin is looking. And lo and behold, I like that phrase a lot today, we now have, if I toggle off and on, a secondary adjustment making the skin much brighter, healthier, and much more fitting with the piece, much more appealing to look at. So that would be a fairly typical practical application of the hue versus sat and the hue versus hue curves. We're going to take a look at the third curve, because these are all essentially hue versus something else curves, unlike the last three, which we'll cover a bit later. I'm going to take a look at the final curve now, and we're almost done, don't worry. And this is hue versus luma, and it's had a bad reputation ever since it was first made, way back in Resolve 12 or something, I think. It used to just be hue v hue and hue v sat back in the olden days. But what hue versus luma does is, following the exact same logic, we can choose a hue to work with, and then we can actually make that hue brighter or darker. Luma is, of course, brightness. So hue versus luma is change brightness based on hue. I can say I want the blues to become brighter, but not more saturated, or darker and not more saturated. Now I'm going to be completely frank with you, I almost never ever use this curve. It was a bit of a lemon, to be honest with you. Back in the olden days it was just not very good. It used to introduce all kinds of weird artifacting, and generally you try and minimize brightness adjustments or luma adjustments within a secondary qualification, because changing the luma or the brightness within a secondary qualification is the most likely thing to reveal the edges of your qualification and to reveal the edges of your secondary adjustment, and thus make your image look unnatural. You'll see exactly what I mean by that when we cover the HSL keyer in a later video, but for now, just kind of keep that logic in mind. Making things much brighter or much darker within a secondary qualification is generally something to avoid. You can do it in a limited capacity, but it's something you don't want to do too much of. So I don't really have an ideal use case for hue versus luma because I never use it. But it's a tool in Resolve, and I'm training you to use Resolve, so here's how it works. For example, if I want to change the skin, it just doesn't look right, you know. Because normally when I'm working with brightness, I want to take the existing contrast into account, and this curve doesn't really do that. It just works with hue, and then it's everything within that range, regardless of how bright it already is, gets the same adjustment, and it's just not a very natural way to work. There's not a lot of good fall off or anything like that within the kind of the contrast range we're working in. So I've rambled on long enough. This video is almost 20 minutes, whereas in the last version I think it was 7. But there's one last thing I want to make absolutely clear when using these curves, and that's that you want to make big, smooth, sweeping curves. You don't want to make a zigzag. So shapes like this are great, they're fine. What we have here is a smooth fall off. We have a gradual reduction of our adjustment rolling off as the hue value changes, and that's going to help hide the edges of our adjustment. What I do not want, and I'm just going to hit the reset button up here, is to make any adjustments which look like this. I don't want zigzags, I don't want issues like this, because what this is going to do is it's going to make very similar values very, very different, and when we do that, let's say we increase the visible or the visibility of noise in the image. Noise is that kind of dancing radio static kind of a look. So if I now play this clip, you'll see what I've got going on in the background there. Because what I've done is I've made very similar values very, very different, we get this kind of chattery dancing effect, because all of these pixels are very slightly different from each other anyway. And the more we exaggerate that through changing contrast, the more different we make them. And so the fact that they're slightly different becomes exaggerated, and then noise becomes much more visible. Noise is always there, it's just whether or not we make it visible is the whole kind of thing. So we do not want to make zigzags like this. We want nice, smooth curves. And if we want to get rid of a point, just right click. So this is the trick, nice, rolling, smooth curves on this interface. So go ahead and have a play around with these tools. Pick a clip, and I would say try and work with some very key visible colours. Skin tones are always a really good one for secondary curves, as well as maybe this background. Now, skin, grass and sky, foliage, these are all really good things to work on with the secondary curves. Work on the foliage in this shot, work on the skin in this shot. Try to work on the skin in this shot and see how you're not going to be able to work on this face independent from this wall. And this is an important learning point. This is spotting when we want to use the curves for general quick work, or when we need to use more advanced tools such as power windows and the keyer, which we're going to cover in our next videos. So go ahead and have a good play around with these tools, and then click on through to the next lecture once you're ready.